What does it do to a human mind when a world everyone thinks they know suddenly turns its hidden face toward you? What happens when a sphere that has followed humanity since the first fires burned on ancient plains, since the first myths were whispered, since the first navigators looked up and trusted the sky, suddenly becomes unfamiliar again? We all grow up with the moon. We think we know it. We see it over rooftops, over deserts, over oceans, over silent villages, over crowded cities, over wars, over celebrations, over nights of loneliness and nights of love. It has watched human history from beginning to now, and yet for almost all of humanity, even in the age of satellites and supercomputers and streaming images and endless information, there has remained one simple, staggering truth. There is still a side of the moon no person on Earth can ever see directly. Tonight, that changes again. For 54 years, no human being had looked upon the far side of the moon with living eyes from close range. Not through a telescope, not through an image transmitted by a robotic probe, not through a rendering on a screen, not through a simulation, not through a textbook, not through memory borrowed from another generation. With their own eyes, the way only a human witness can truly see, the way the brain absorbs depth, texture, scale, brightness, darkness, motion, silence, danger, and awe all at once. That is what makes this moment so powerful. Machines have photographed the far side. Near orbiters have mapped it. Scientists have studied it in exquisite detail. But the difference between data and direct human sight is the difference between reading the word ocean and standing at the edge of one. And before we go deeper, take 1 second and let yourself feel the scale of that. If this kind of journey pulls something awake inside you, if it makes you feel that old human hunger to know what lies beyond the horizon, stay with this story all the way through, because this is not only about a spacecraft and not only about a mission. This is about the return of a human viewpoint that disappeared before most people alive today were even born. And if space is the one place that still makes you feel properly small in the best possible way, then you already know why people are drawn to stories like this. You do not watch them only to learn facts. You watch them to remember what wonder feels like. The moon's far side has always carried a strange burden in the human imagination. Not because it is supernatural, and not because it is dark in the sense of eternal night, though people often call it the dark side by mistake. The far side receives sunlight just like the near side. Day comes, night comes, light moves, shadows crawl, temperatures rise and fall with merciless extremes. It is not dark because the sun never touches it. It is hidden because Earth does not. The moon rotates on its axis at nearly the same rate that it orbits our planet, a state called tidal locking. So from Earth, we see almost the same face again and again, night after night, generation after generation. The moon is moving, it is turning. But it turns in such a way that one hemisphere always looks back at us and the other keeps its distance. That single physical fact created one of the most profound visual mysteries in the sky. Imagine if one half of a mountain range could never be seen from Earth. Imagine if one side of an entire continent existed only in theory for thousands of years. Imagine if one face of a familiar person remained forever unseen. That is what the moon gave us. Not total ignorance, because science broke that barrier decades ago, but emotional separation. The near side is the moon of poems, lovers' calendars, harvest nights, children's drawings, and ancient myths. The far side is the moon of impact scars, hidden basins, radio silence, and geological memories preserved beyond human sight. And that difference is not only poetic, it is written into the rock itself. The side of the moon we see from Earth is marked by great dark plains called Maria, ancient volcanic basins filled long ago by lava that cooled into vast dark surfaces visible even to the naked eye. Those dark patches shaped the face humanity learned to recognize. But the far side is different, much more heavily cratered, much rougher, much more dominated by ancient highlands, brighter in tone, harsher in texture, less softened by the broad dark seas that define the near side. The familiar moon is not the whole moon. It never was. Humanity's mental image of our nearest cosmic neighbour has always been incomplete. Now think about what that means for a crew leaving Earth behind. They are not flying toward a symbol. They are flying toward a place, a real world with real topography, real danger, Real distances, real orbital mechanics, real thermal extremes, real silence. And when that world begins to rotate relative to their path, when the features known to us since the dawn of civilization slide away, and new terrain starts to emerge, it is not just a visual transition, it is a psychological rupture. One reality is being replaced by another in real time. The moon ceases to be the flat icon of human culture, and becomes once again what it has always been beneath the symbolism, a foreign landscape. The last humans who experienced this did so in the Apollo era, when spacecraft crossed the vast gulf between Earth and the Moon, and slipped behind the lunar limb into radio silence. Apollo did not merely land men on the Moon, it changed the scale of human presence. Apollo astronauts left the neighbourhood of Earth. They did not circle close to home, they went to another world. Apollo 8 first carried humans to lunar orbit and gave them the far side and Earthrise. Apollo 10 rehearsed, Apollo 11 landed, Apollo 12, 14, 15, 16, and 17 followed, each mission adding detail to the human experience of the Moon. And then the line broke. The path was not extended, it was abandoned. That gap matters. People often talk about spaceflight as if progress rises in a smooth upward curve, as if once something has been done it remains part of normal civilization. But that is not how history works. Capabilities can be lost, momentum can be lost, public will can be lost, political appetite can collapse, engineering cultures can disperse, a civilization can stand at the edge of a new age and then step backward, not because it cannot go farther, but because it decides not to pay the price. That is what happened after Apollo. Humanity reached the Moon, proved the impossible was possible, and then turned inward again. The reasons were not mysterious. Apollo was born in geopolitical rivalry and sustained by enormous national urgency. It demanded astonishing money, relentless industrial effort, and a willingness to accept extraordinary risk. Once the political objective had been achieved, the appetite for continuing at that scale faded. Other priorities took over. Budgets shifted. The dream that had seemed unstoppable became optional, and optional things are easy to postpone. The space age did not end, but it narrowed. Human spaceflight focused increasingly on low Earth orbit. Shuttle missions, space stations, construction in Earth's backyard. Vital work, impressive work, often beautiful work, but still work done close enough that Earth filled the window and rescue, while never simple, was part of the realm of the imaginable. What disappeared was deep space human flight. The region between Earth and Moon, cislunar space, became a place of instruments and mathematics, not a place of human breath. Generation after generation grew up with extraordinary images from robotic spacecraft, yet without any living memory of a human being passing behind the Moon. There were astronauts alive who had done it. There were recordings, there were photographs, there were books. But for the world at large, it had become almost mythic, like hearing old sailors speak of waters no modern ship had crossed. This is why the return matters, not because the Moon forgot us. Not because the far side changed its ancient silence for our absence, but because humans did. We changed. We normalized staying close to home. We learned to think of the Moon as distant again, not in miles, but in confidence. The route remained physically possible, but psychologically, culturally, politically, it became remote, a thing of black and white footage and old voices crackling over static. So when a new crew finally rides that path, what returns is not only access. What returns is a broken continuity in human self-belief, and that is where Artemis enters the story. Not as nostalgia, not as a simple reenactment, not as an attempt to replay Apollo in a world that no longer exists. Artemis is the opening architecture of a new lunar era, one that seeks not only flags and footprints, but enduring operations, deeper systems, long-term presence, and the experience needed for journeys even farther away. But before permanent ambitions can become reality, the machines have to prove themselves. The crews have to live in them. The procedures have to work outside the comfort of Earth orbit. Confidence has to be built with real distance, real speed, real heat, real delay, real exposure. A crude lunar flyby sounds modest compared to a landing, and yet that word modest hides how difficult such a mission truly is. To send people beyond low Earth orbit is to leave the domain where most human spaceflight has occurred. It means higher energies, longer distances, less immediate support, harder returns, fewer easy abort options, and a broader spectrum of failure consequences. It means the spacecraft must not merely keep its occupants alive for a few orbits around Earth. It must function as a tiny moving world in deep space, carrying heat, water, oxygen, power, communications, navigation, and a margin against chaos. That is why the spacecraft matters so much. Orion is not merely a cabin with seats and windows. It is a pressure vessel, a thermal system, a digital nervous system, a life support system, a shield against vacuum, a shelter against darkness and heat, a machine that must be both rugged and precise. Every surface inside it represents a layer of intention. Every checklist is a defense against disorder. Every indicator and display is part of a bargain between human beings and engineered complexity. The crew does not survive because space is kind. They survive because thousands of people on Earth worked obsessively to make kindness unnecessary. And still, no amount of engineering removes the raw fact of exposure. Outside the spacecraft is vacuum that kills quietly and completely. Outside is radiation not softened by Earth's magnetosphere, the way low orbit often is. Outside are temperature extremes that do not negotiate. Outside is micrometeoroid risk, the possibility of tiny fast-moving impacts, each one insignificant until one is not. Outside is the black that does not look black in photographs, because cameras fail to capture what the human nervous system feels when it recognizes true depthless emptiness. There is no up, there is no down, there is only motion, fields, mass, and the thin boundary between order and the infinite cold. But a mission like this is never only about hardware. The crew themselves are part of the system. Their training is not ornamental, it is central. They must know procedures so thoroughly that fear cannot erase them. They must know how to troubleshoot, how to prioritize, how to communicate clearly when adrenaline wants to turn language into fragments. They must function in close quarters, in delay, in fatigue, in isolation, in wonder. They must do the strange human thing of handling routine tasks while carrying the awareness that a few millimeters of metal and composite stand between ordinary conversation and immediate death. And perhaps the strangest part is this: even when the engineering is sound and the crew is ready, no one can truly rehearse the meaning of the view. You can simulate controls, you can simulate timelines, you can simulate failures, noises, alerts, procedures, power conditions, docking logic, re-entry loads, and emergency branches. But you cannot fully simulate the sight of Earth shrinking. You cannot fully simulate the first time the moon ceases to be a distant disk and becomes a looming terrain. You cannot fully simulate the emotional pressure of seeing a hidden hemisphere and understanding, in a flash more physical than verbal, that you are standing within a continuity that vanished before you were born. Launch itself is the least subtle reminder that spaceflight is not normal. Rockets do not persuade gravity. They assault it. The energy release is violent by design. Fuel becomes thrust. Thrust becomes acceleration. Acceleration becomes noise, vibration, pressure, thermal stress, structural load, and a controlled act of defiance against Earth's grasp. People watching from a distance see spectacle. The crew feels the animal force of it through seats, straps, bones, chest, and teeth. They know that the machine is performing exactly as intended, and yet there is no civil way to ride a rocket. It is power made audible. Then comes orbit, that deceptive pause after violence, when the spacecraft seems suddenly to have relaxed. But orbit is only an intermediate truth. For a lunar mission, Earth orbit is not the destination. It is the ledge from which departure becomes possible. The spacecraft is checked, systems are assessed, data flows. The crew performs tasks with practiced calm. Beneath the procedures, a quiet realization begins to take shape. This is the last stretch in which Earth still feels near. Soon the burn will come that commits them outward, away from the familiar circular comfort of orbit and into a path that carries them toward another world. That departure burn is one of those moments that seems abstract when explained in mission diagrams, but becomes profound when lived. A change in velocity, a line on a graph, a sequence in a checklist. Yet what it means existentially is simple. Home is no longer the centre of the mission. Earth becomes origin rather than environment. Once the translunar trajectory is established, the crew is no longer merely above Earth. They are on their way beyond it. That is an ancient threshold in a new form. The tribe has left the valley. The the ship has lost sight of shore. As the hours pass and the distance grows, Earth begins one of the most unsettling visual transformations a human can witness. In low Earth orbit, our planet dominates everything. It fills the sky, wraps the window with colour, weather, ocean, desert, cloud, curvature, light, shadow. Even when you know you are in space, you still feel held by the planet's presence. But on a lunar path, Earth slowly releases its grip on the senses. It becomes smaller, not instantly, but unmistakably. And because it grows smaller at a human rate rather than a cinematic one, the mind has time to understand what is happening. You are leaving the only biosphere you have ever known. This is where cislunar space begins to teach its harsh lesson. The region between Earth and Moon is not empty in the emotional sense, but it is sparse in the practical sense. There are no stations nearby, no orbital neighbourhoods bustling with infrastructure, no quick turnarounds, no easy rendezvous to solve a problem. Distances expand, signal travel time becomes noticeable. The mission is still controlled, still connected, and still monitored by an enormous support network, but the psychological texture changes. The crew is not merely far from home, they are entering an environment in which every system must continue to deserve their trust. And the farther they go, the more the Moon changes. At first it is still the familiar coin of human culture, the face from Earth, the shape from childhood. Then details sharpen. Craters that were once abstract marks become bowls with walls and shadows. Boundaries between bright and dark regions become landscapes. The mind does something remarkable when confronted with this scale shift. It abandons symbol and adopts place. The Moon stops being an object in the sky and becomes terrain suspended in blackness, a destination, a body, a world whose gravity can pull, whose horizon can hide, whose mass can shape a trajectory. There is a quiet dread and beauty in that approach because the near side carries familiarity right up until it does not. The crew sees the face humanity has always seen, the planes, the known patterns, the geography of our species' imagination. And then geometry begins its work. The path of the spacecraft relative to the Moon causes the edge to turn. What had seemed fixed starts to move. Known landmarks slip away. Curvature reveals more than it conceals. This is not the Moon rising over Earth or Earth rising over a lunar horizon. It is a hidden hemisphere entering human vision for the first time in more than half a century. Try to imagine the exact second that familiarity ends. One moment the eye recognizes the Moon it has known forever. The next it is confronted with a face that does not match memory. There are no dark maria spread in the same broad patterns. There is no comfort of recognition. There is brightness where the near side often appears dark. There is crater upon crater, ancient scars layered over ancient scars, an intensity of battered terrain that gives the surface a different emotional temperature. It is still the Moon, and yet it does not feel like the Moon of Earth. It feels older, harsher, almost more truthful. Why is the far side like this? The answer lies in ancient heat, crustal thickness, volcanic history, and impacts that shaped the Moon billions of years ago. The near side's crust appears thinner in key regions, which helped magma rise and flood giant impact basins, creating the dark volcanic plains that humans easily see from Earth. The far side's crust is generally thicker, and so those immense maria are much less common there. The result is a hemisphere dominated by older, heavily cratered highlands. In some sense, the far side preserves more of the Moon's violence. It is a museum of collisions so old that they predate all life on Earth, complex enough to look up and ask what the Moon was. That is one reason scientists value it so deeply. The far side is not merely visually dramatic, it holds clues to the early history of the Earth-Moon system, to ancient impact processes, to crust formation, to planetary differentiation, to the relentless bombardment that shaped worlds in the young solar system. It includes one of the most extraordinary structures known in planetary science, the South Pole Aitken Basin, a colossal impact basin on the lunar far side, among the largest and oldest recognised in the solar system. To orbit or pass near such a place is to brush against an event of almost incomprehensible scale, a wound carved when the solar system was young and brutal. But scientific importance is only part of what this site does to people. Human perception has its own authority. When astronauts describe seeing Earth from space, or watching sunrise over a cratered horizon, or noticing the starkness of shadows, Their words matter not only because they are poetic, but because they reveal how reality changes when the body is present. The far side in a database is information. The far side through a spacecraft window is witness. The eye picks out contrast, depth, brightness, subtle colour variation, and motion in a way no compressed image fully preserves. The body understands scale in a way text cannot teach. And then there is the silence behind the moon. When a spacecraft passes beyond the lunar limb relative to Earth, direct communication can be interrupted. In the Apollo era, this created some of the most suspenseful minutes in human exploration. Mission Control could predict the blackout, understand it, prepare for it, and still feel its weight. The crew would disappear into radio silence behind another world. No voice, no confirmation, no new data, only a timeline and trust. The moon itself became a wall between human beings separated by less than a second of light time under normal conditions, yet now divided by rock, geometry, and the oldest form of distance, not being able to speak. There is something nearly sacred about that kind of silence. The crew knows it is expected. They know the communications profile. They understand the orbital mechanics. They understand that physics, not mystery, has interrupted the connection. And yet knowledge does not cancel feeling. To be behind the moon is to be hidden not only from sight, but from contact. Earth cannot immediately hear you. The planet of your species, with all its oceans and cities and wars and languages and songs, lies just beyond a horizon of stone, and for a short time you are truly on the other side. Those minutes do something to the imagination, because they reduce civilization to a thought carried in memory. Every person you have ever known is back there. Every tree, every street, every graveyard, every school, every temple, every stadium, every argument, every promise, every broadcast, every child asleep in a bedroom, every person praying in fear, every person laughing in a kitchen, every person driving home beneath cloud and light, all of them are on one world beyond the rock, and you, with a handful of other humans, are moving in silence behind another. It is both the loneliest and one of the most connected feelings a person can have. The moon's far side intensifies this sensation because it has always symbolized hiddenness. People have projected mystery onto it for centuries simply because they could not see it. Entire fantasies were built around what might be there long before spacecraft revealed the truth. Yet even when science dissolves fantasy, it does not destroy wonder. In some cases, it deepens it. The far side is not mysterious because monsters live there or because the laws of physics fail there. It is mysterious because it remained outside ordinary human vision for so long, and because even now, to stand in relation to it as a witness requires leaving Earth entirely. There is a temptation in modern culture to assume that once images exist, direct experience becomes somehow redundant. We can see photographs of mountains, storms, coral reefs, black holes rendered from data, the surface of Mars, the rings of Saturn, galaxies billions of light years away. And because the image reaches us easily, we begin to believe the experience has been democratized in a complete sense, but it has not. Seeing an image of a place and inhabiting the geometric relationship that makes that sight possible are radically different things. The far side on a screen is knowledge. The far side from a spacecraft is position, risk, embodiment, and presence. As that is why this moment echoes so deeply through history. For more than half a century, no human nervous system occupied the position required to see that landscape directly. No human eye tracked its crater chains across real curvature in real time. No human brain integrated the brightness, shadow, and horizon of that hidden hemisphere while feeling the reality of being there. We had not forgotten the far side scientifically. We had lost it experientially. Artemis restores that experience, and in restoring it, the mission restores a forgotten category of human existence, living beyond Earth's immediate embrace and looking back at a world from the threshold of another. To understand the weight of that, consider the crew themselves. Their job is not to be overwhelmed. Their job is to function. They must read instruments, confirm attitudes, execute procedures, monitor systems, think clearly, communicate efficiently, and move through the mission timeline. That discipline is part of what makes the emotional dimension so striking, because somewhere inside those calm practiced actions there must also be a private awareness impossible to entirely suppress. They know what this means, they know the history, they know who last saw this view, They know how long humanity waited. Even if their training teaches composure, the moment must still break across the inner life like weather. Imagine looking out and seeing a cratered landscape with no human footprints, no landing modules, no nearby base, no glowing city, no sign that your species has ever touched it. Just old impacts, old light, old silence. The moon becomes what worlds mostly are: indifferent, beautiful, whole, ancient and utterly unconcerned with your story. And yet your story insists on existing there. That tension is the essence of exploration. The universe does not need us. It does not bend toward our dreams. But we go anyway. We cross distance anyway. We build fragile vessels and carry our questions into the dark anyway. If there is one image that always returns whenever humans travel to the moon, it is Earthrise. Not because Earth physically rises over the lunar horizon everywhere in the same way it appears to do in orbit, but because that visual relationship between Earth and Moon reveals something morally clarifying. Earth seen from lunar distance is not a place of borders. It is not an argument. It is not a map divided by ideology. It is a blue-white sphere suspended in blackness, shining with the only oceans, clouds, forests, rivers, the cities and breathable skies we know. From the moon, Earth looks less like property and more like miracle. That perspective has transformed astronauts before, and it may do so again. Some called it the overview effect, but the phrase is almost too clinical for the depth of the change. It is not simply seeing Earth from far away. It is feeling the absurd tenderness of it. The realization that everything soft and living you have ever loved exists in a thin biosphere wrapped around a ball of rock and water drifting through an immense and mostly hostile cosmos. That understanding does not solve human conflict. It does not erase greed or violence, but it can make them look smaller, pettier, less convincing. Distance has a way of exposing what matters, and perhaps that is part of what makes the far side so psychologically powerful. It combines two revelations at once. One is outward. The moon is more alien in person than familiarity allows. The other is inward. Earth is more precious in distance than everyday life permits us to feel. The crew does not merely observe a hidden lunar landscape. They observe the relationship between worlds. They witness how near and far exchange meanings when one leaves home. The moon becomes real. Earth becomes fragile. Humanity becomes both tiny and strangely more unified. Yet none of this beauty erases the risk. Deep space travel remains dangerous in ways that beauty can make people forget. Radiation is not a cinematic beam. It is invisible exposure accumulated over time, influenced by solar activity, shielding, mission duration, and geometry. A solar particle event at the wrong moment can turn a mission into a medical emergency. These systems failures that might be manageable near Earth become more serious at lunar distances. Guidance errors matter. Thermal control matters. Power margins matter. Water recycling, air management, battery performance, attitude control, communications routing, software integrity. Everything matters because there is no trivial component in a spacecraft carrying human beings through cislunar space. And then there is re-entry, the final proof that spaceflight is a round trip only if physics allows it. Returning from the moon is not like returning from low Earth orbit. The spacecraft comes home carrying far greater energy. That energy must be managed, bled off through the atmosphere in a fiery negotiation between speed and survival. The heat shield is not decorative. It is destiny shaped into material science. At the wrong angle, the vehicle can skip like a stone. Too steep and loads become extreme. The atmosphere, which protects life on Earth every day without asking for thanks, becomes in re-entry both shield and threat. To come home from lunar distance is to fall correctly. But before that return, before fire wraps the capsule, before parachutes bloom, before recovery forces rush in and the hatch opens and Earth's air touches faces that have breathed only the craft's life support for days, there is still the passage around the moon itself. And this is where the mission reaches its deepest emotional note. The far side is not an achievement in the ordinary sense. It is not a medal or a record in the shallow competitive way humans often talk about firsts and longest and biggest. It is something older, a restored encounter. A reopening of a human relationship with hidden geography. What kind of relationship is that? Partly scientific, certainly. The moon is a laboratory of early solar system history. Partly strategic, yes. Nations and agencies understand that cislunar capability shapes future exploration and infrastructure. Partly technological, of course. Everything learned there feeds later missions, later vehicles, later habitats, later navigation systems, later survival architectures. But beneath all those layers lies something simpler and more stubborn. Humans are horizon crossers. We become restless when a boundary remains merely mapped and not visited. The far side has been known, yet not known in the oldest human sense, seen by eyes belonging to a living explorer. This is why robotic exploration and human exploration are not enemies. They are different instruments of knowledge. Robots are tireless, exacting, resilient in environments lethal to flesh, and they can go places humans should not yet go. They can stay longer, measure more, risk more. But they do not experience. They do not wonder. They do not speak afterward in the peculiar language of a species trying to make emotional sense of a reality too large for grammar. When a human sees something, the event enters culture differently. It enters memory differently. It enters our story not as collected data alone, but as lived testimony. And testimony has consequences. The Apollo photographs did not merely educate. They altered art, philosophy, environmental consciousness, and the emotional vocabulary of modern civilization. Earthries helped people feel planetary fragility in a new way. Images of astronauts on the lunar surface changed the scale at which humanity imagined itself operating. If Artemis renews the human view of the far side, it may do something similar for a new century. Not because the image alone will solve our problems, but because civilizations need symbols anchored in truth. They need evidence that they are still capable of difficult, meaningful acts beyond immediate consumption and distraction. Think of a child watching this mission years from now, or hearing the story of what the crew saw. For that child, the far side will not be merely an archival concept from the age of grandparents. It will be part of a living continuum. Someone from our own era went there. Someone looked. Someone described it. Someone carried that sight back into language. That matters. It tells the next generation that deep space is not closed territory. It is not a museum. It is not a graveyard of past ambition. It is an unfinished road, and roads matter even before they are crowded. The first ship route across an ocean does not transform civilization because thousands instantly follow. It transforms civilization because the unknown is narrowed and a pattern becomes possible. Artemis II, as a crewed lunar mission, is part of establishing that pattern again. It is saying that humans can leave Earth orbit, travel to the moon, operate effectively, return safely, and do so not as a one-time stunt but as the beginning of a sustained architecture. That is what changes history. Not a single dramatic gesture, but the conversion of the extraordinary into the repeatable. Still, on the level of one human heart, it is the sight itself that lingers. Imagine the far side crossing the window, ancient crater fields sliding past with slow, majestic inevitability. Shadows stretched long and black at the edges of rims, highlands bright under angled sunlight, scarred basins large enough to humble thought. No atmospheric haze softening anything, because the moon has no air to blur distance or tint light. Edges remain sharp. Contrast remains brutal. The scene is almost too honest, too unfiltered, too stripped of familiar earthly softness. It is beauty without comfort. On Earth, distance usually hides detail behind atmosphere. Mountains fade blue, horizons blur, moisture diffuses light. But in lunar space, the absence of atmosphere makes everything visually severe. A crater wall many kilometers away can seem unnervingly crisp. Shadows look like cutouts of absolute black because there is no air to scatter light into them. The landscape does not glow with life. It reflects sunlight with mineral indifference, and this visual severity may be one of the reasons astronauts often struggle to describe what they see. Human language evolved for weather, trees, bodies, water, animals, emotion, and social life. It was not built for explaining the aesthetic of airless worlds. Yet they try, and in trying, they enlarge language. That is one of the hidden gifts of exploration. It forces speech to stretch. It introduces new combinations of words, new metaphors, new inadequacies that become new attempts. The moon's far side may be described as battered, ancient, lonely, radiant, severe, silent, unreal, profoundly real. None of these are sufficient. Together they form an outline around the experience. And perhaps that is all language can ever do with the largest truths. not capture them fully, but circle them faithfully. The same is true of fear. Space agencies do not celebrate fear, but they never truly eliminate it either. Courage in exploration is not the absence of fear, it is the capacity to work inside it. Somewhere beneath every calm status, call and checklist response lives an awareness that nothing out there is forgiving. A valve problem, a software anomaly, a sensor disagreement, a thermal issue, a guidance discrepancy. Any one of these can escalate. That is why the discipline of flight is so severe. The spacecraft may inspire poetry, but it survives on procedure. Wonder alone does not keep pressure inside a hull, and yet the existence of danger intensifies meaning. If the far side could be reached in perfect comfort, if it were a casual tourist route, if stepping behind the moon required no more effort than boarding a train, it would still be beautiful, but it would not mean the same thing. Part of why the moment feels so profound is because it remains hard. Humanity still has to organise intellect, money, patience, risk tolerance, engineering, political will and moral seriousness to place a few people in position to see that hidden world. Difficulty gives weight to witness. This is an uncomfortable truth in an age that often expects immediacy. The things that most enlarge civilization are rarely easy, cheap, or instantly useful in the narrowest sense. They are often costly, slow, uncertain, and vulnerable to ridicule from people who ask what practical problem is solved by looking at another world. But that question misunderstands the shape of human flourishing. Not all value is immediate utility. Some value lies in expanding the scale of what a culture believes itself capable of attempting. Some lies in the technologies spun off by difficult goals, some lies in scientific knowledge, and some lies in the spiritual fact that a species that stops looking outward too completely risks shrinking inward. The far side of the moon is a perfect symbol of that principle, because it has always been there, waiting not for invention, but for return. We did not need to discover the far side existed. We needed to put ourselves again in the place from which it could be seen. That distinction is important. Many frontiers in history are not hidden because the world is secretive. They are hidden because we have not chosen to travel. The far side has been patient. Human history was the impatient part, and now, once more, human eyes are there. The sentence should be allowed to land with its full force. Human eyes are there, not lenses alone, not algorithms, not transmitted pixels arriving at Earth from an obedient machine. Eyes carrying memory, expectation, mortality, training, fatigue, emotion, and the strange inner life of our species. Eyes that once looked at trees, oceans, classrooms, instruments, families, clouds, and city lights, now looking at a hidden lunar hemisphere floating beneath blackness so pure it almost feels metaphysical. That is not a trivial difference. That is the difference between unmanned reach and inhabited experience. If you're wondering why the title of this story feels almost unbelievable, that is because history trained us to think the unbelievable had become normal, and then taught us the opposite by making us wait. The moon's far side with human eyes should, in one version of the future, have become a common if still profound experience by the late 20th century. There might have been repeated missions, stations, vehicles, long-duration operations, perhaps even schools teaching children through live feeds from lunar orbit, as routinely as weather broadcasts. But history bent another way, so what might have become familiar remained astonishing. This also means the crew carries a peculiar burden of representation. They are not only doing their jobs, they are standing in for a long interval of absence. When they look, billions look through the fact of their presence, even if not through their exact sensory experience. The crew becomes a bridge between the Apollo witnesses and everyone born afterward. They repair continuity. They make it newly possible to say that living humans in our own era have seen the far side in person. That single statement reaches farther than it first appears, because once such a statement becomes true again, many other possibilities begin to feel less distant. Lunar orbit operations feel less theoretical. Surface returns feel less symbolic and more imminent. Infrastructure in cislunar space feels less speculative. Even Mars, which remains enormously harder, begins to move in the imagination from mythic to procedural. One successful step beyond low Earth orbit does not guarantee the next, but it changes the emotional mathematics. The gap between worlds becomes a route rather than a dream. Still, perhaps the deepest meaning of the far side is not what it suggests about the future, but what it reveals about the present. It reveals that humanity is still capable of collective effort aimed above the horizon. It reveals that long arcs can resume after interruption. It reveals that the old human pact between curiosity and courage is not dead. And it reveals something humbling too. The universe remains large enough to make even our greatest achievements feel delicate. The moon does not become less ancient because we arrive. We become more aware of our brevity. So from that awareness comes one of the most important effects of deep space exploration: perspective on time. The cratered far side is a record of impacts spanning billions of years. Earth, by contrast, erases much of its own violent history through weather, water, plate tectonics, and life. The moon remembers more visibly. To look at those scars is to look at a timeline far older than nations, older than mammals, older than complex terrestrial ecosystems, older perhaps than the conditions under which life as we know it stabilized on Earth. The far side is a page from a book written before human concerns existed, and yet human concerns arrive there anyway, fragile and immediate. The crew may think about oxygen partial pressure, fuel margins, checklists, nutrition packets, cabin procedures, communication windows, camera angles, and rest cycles while also absorbing the geology of deep time. That collision between the routine and the cosmic is one of the most human things imaginable. We do not stop being practical creatures just because we enter sublime environments. We carry our mortal logistics with us into the grandest places. We adjust straps and read panels while passing worlds. Maybe that is why spaceflight feels so intimate despite its vast setting. A mission is always about systems and nations and budgets and engineering teams, but inside the vehicle it narrows to breathing, seeing, speaking, trusting, enduring. Exploration is often discussed as if it belongs only to history books, but in the moment it belongs to bodies. Someone feels thirst, someone checks a display, someone glances out the window a half-second longer than necessary because the sight is too immense to ignore. Someone hears a crewmate say a quiet sentence that will later be remembered for decades. Someone experiences awe in the middle of a task. If the far side teaches anything, it may be this: hiddenness is relative. The hemisphere was hidden from Earth, but never from the laws of nature. It did not hide itself. It merely occupied a geometry that required effort to overcome. Many of our greatest human frontiers are like that. They are not impossible. They are not forbidden. They simply demand alignment of knowledge, tools, will, and timing. The moon's far side waited through wars, recessions, elections, technological revolutions, cultural upheavals, and the rise of whole generations until once again that alignment occurred. And what does the crew see when it finally does? They see a world without atmosphere, without weather, without birds, without rivers, without grass, without movement except motion governed by celestial mechanics and the slow crawl of light across stone. They see impact overprint upon impact overprint, ancient violence fossilized in mineral form. They see brightness that is not warmth. They see shadows that are not softness. They see a hemisphere less visually friendly than the face turned toward Earth, and perhaps for that reason more startlingly honest about what the moon is. The near side allowed humanity to project faces and animals and myths onto it, because its dark planes produced recognizable patterns. The far side resists that projection more strongly. It offers fewer obvious symbols, fewer familiar markings for imagination to grab. It is not blank. It is overwhelmingly detailed. But its detail is geological rather than mythic. It does not invite anthropomorphic interpretation so easily. That may be one reason it feels so strange. It strips the moon of some of the cultural clothing we gave it and returns it to planetary reality. That reality includes silence so complete it is hard to describe. Space is often portrayed in media with music swelling, engines rumbling, dramatic effects amplifying each moment. In truth, outside the spacecraft there is no airborne sound at all. The moon's far side passes in utter external silence. No wind, no atmosphere murmuring, no distant thunder, no rustle of anything living. The spacecraft carries its own noises inside. Fans, pumps, clicks, voices, the subtle mechanical soundtrack of life support and equipment. But the world outside remains mute. The contrast between inner sound and outer silence must be unforgettable. And then, somewhere in that passage, Earth appears again in relation to the moon, and the crew is offered the other great view of lunar flight, home framed by otherworldly foreground. This is one of those scenes that can reorder a person. The Earth, full of weather and colour and life, hangs above or beyond grey terrain that has none of those things. A dead world and a living one share a window. It is an image of contrast so complete that it almost becomes philosophy. One world carries forests, oceans, voices, microbes, insects, cities, migrations, and love. The other carries memory and rock and the possibility of future human presence. Both shine, only one breathes. What would a crew member think in that moment? Perhaps of family. Perhaps of the absurd fact that everyone they love fits inside that small sphere. Perhaps of history, of all the generations who looked at the moon and never imagined they might one day look back from it. Perhaps of the missions that came before and the graves of those who never lived to see this return. Perhaps of the future, of children not yet born who may someday consider the far side as familiar as low Earth orbit is to us. Or perhaps of nothing at all for a few precious seconds, because some sights overtake thought and leave only raw perception. There is something medicinal about such perception, not in a sentimental way, not because it fixes everything, but because it interrupts the self's usual scale. Most of us live inside worries proportioned to rooms, bills, your relationships, local politics, screens, routines. These things matter. They form the texture of life. But occasionally a civilization needs reminders that its home is a planet and its context is cosmic, not to diminish ordinary life, but to honour it by seeing how improbable it is. The far side seen by human eyes does exactly that. It reframes everyday existence as something carried inside a much larger frame. This is also why lunar missions matter, even to people who may never care about the technical details. They matter because they create events big enough to cut through fragmentation. For a moment, people who agree on almost nothing can look upward together. They can argue later about budgets, priorities, national narratives, strategic implications. Those conversations are real and necessary. But before the argument comes the sight, humans again at the moon, humans again behind the moon, humans again seeing the unseen. Some achievements restore a shared vocabulary of wonder, and that has civic value even when it does not appear on a balance sheet. Of course, the mission's tangible returns are substantial too. Systems are tested under real deep space conditions. Operations teams learn what simulation could not fully teach. Life support performance, communications behaviour, navigation under actual mission stress, crew workload management, radiation measurements, thermal control profiles, integration between vehicle and ground support. All of this matters for the missions to come. Exploration is cumulative. Every successful procedure becomes future confidence. Every anomaly becomes future wisdom. Artemis II is not merely a spectacle. It is an investment in competence. And competence is the true opposite of romantic fantasy in spaceflight. It is possible to love exploration and still understand that survival depends on discipline, perhaps especially then. The most inspiring missions are often the most procedural beneath the visible drama. There is no contradiction there. In fact, procedure is what makes inspiration durable. A civilization that dreams without building vanishes into myth. A civilization that builds without dreaming becomes spiritually thin. The best exploration marries the two. It keeps poetry honest and engineering meaningful. That marriage is visible everywhere in this journey. The launch vehicle represents brute-controlled power, thousands of tons translated into ascent. The spacecraft represents protective precision, every subsystem arranged around human survival. The trajectory represents celestial mechanics so exact that a small error can grow into a serious problem over distance. The view represents cosmic beauty indifferent to human symbolism, and the crew represents consciousness carried into that machinery and that beauty together. Each element alone is impressive. Combined, they become an event worthy of memory. So when the title says the crew just saw something no human has seen in 54 years, the real force of the statement lies not in novelty alone, but in continuity restored. It tells us that the chain broken after Apollo has a new link. It tells us that a hidden hemisphere has re-entered living human sight. It tells us that our species, though often distracted and divided, can still align itself around difficult acts that enlarge perspective. It tells us that history is not only decline, not only repetition, not only distraction. Sometimes history is return, and return has its own emotional geometry. To return somewhere after a long absence is never the same as arriving the first time. The second encounter is haunted by memory, by loss, by the awareness of what did not happen in between. Artemis carries that awareness. The crew is not naive to the decades between then and now. They know the path should perhaps never have gone cold for so long. That knowledge makes the accomplishment sweeter and sadder at once. We're celebrating a return, yes, but also remembering an absence. Still, absence can sharpen gratitude. Perhaps that is why this view feels almost unbearably rich. It contains not only the far side itself, but the lost years folded into it. Every decade without human lunar flight deepens the meaning of the first view back. Every generation that grew up without expecting people to go there adds emotional density to the moment. The cratered landscape becomes not only geology, but time recovered. It is the visible proof that some doors can open again, even after history leaves them shut for too long. There is another subtle meaning here too. The far side has often been treated as synonymous with hidden truth in literature and metaphor. The unseen side of things, the part turned away from ordinary observation, the secret face. To physically travel and see it again does not just satisfy curiosity about one celestial body. It reminds us of a more general principle. Reality is always larger than the portion visible from where we stand. Every familiar thing may contain an unseen side. Every settled picture may be incomplete. Exploration is, in that sense, an antidote to complacency. The moon taught humanity that lesson once before. We looked up at a constant face and assumed familiarity. Then spacecraft revealed the other side, different and rougher than the one we knew. Now humans see it again directly, and the lesson repeats at a higher level. Knowledge is not a static possession. It can deepen, widen, change texture, become newly alive when direct encounter returns. The far side was never unknown in the strict scientific sense after the space age began, but it becomes known differently when eyes, not just instruments, meet it. As the spacecraft continues on its path and the moon begins eventually to fall behind, another emotional transition occurs. The crew has seen what they came to see, and yet in some ways the sight only now begins its longest journey, inward. A landscape can pass out of a window in minutes, but continue unfolding in thought for years. Memory works more slowly than orbit. The crew may later recall not just the geometry of the terrain, but the precise feeling of the cabin at that moment, the voices, the light on a panel, the silence between words, the awareness that an entire civilization had waited for this view to become human again. And then comes the turn homeward. The trajectory that carried them outward now becomes the promise of return. There is relief in that, but also a quiet melancholy. Every great journey contains a moment when the traveller realises the peak is already behind them, and the task now is safe homecoming. Yet homecoming is never lesser. It is the act that converts experience into shared reality. If explorers never returned, their journeys would become silence. The purpose of coming back is to translate witness into culture. So the spacecraft flies on, systems checked and rechecked, Earth growing slowly larger again, though still distant enough to appear fragile. The crew carries the far side not in cargo but in memory and record. The moon continues as it always has, turning its hidden face away from Earth, indifferent to the human significance attached to this passage. But indifference on the part of the universe does not diminish meaning on the part of humans. In a sense, it intensifies it. Meaning is something we make responsibly in the face of a cosmos that offers no shortcuts. Eventually the return tightens into its final sequence. Separation, orientation, re-entry interface, heating, plasma, communications effects, the physical violence of falling back into atmosphere after a voyage no low Earth orbit mission can fully imitate. The capsule, so serene in deep space, becomes once more a machine under extreme stress. The shield glows. Air, which was absent all the way around the moon, now slams into the vehicle at tremendous speed and becomes incandescent. It is one of the strangest transformations in all exploration. The emptiness that made the journey possible gives way to the atmosphere that makes home possible. When parachutes deploy and the descent stabilizes, the mission's emotional arc nears completion. Splashdown or recovery is never the most visually grand part of a lunar mission, yet it may be the most human, because after all the machinery, all the distance, all the ancient landscapes and hidden horizons and global attention, what it comes down to is simple. Did they come home? Exploration is noble, but return is mercy. A successful re-entry tells the species that the road outward is also a road back. It tells future crews that the promise holds, and then the hatch opens. Fresh air, recovery personnel. Gravity felt again in its full familiar insistence. The weird tenderness of Earth after days in the spacecraft. Sky not seen through a window. Wind, smell, humidity. The dense living atmosphere pressing against skin. After seeing the moon's dead far side with human eyes, Earth itself must feel transformed. Not because Earth changed during the mission, but because perspective did. Home is never fully the same after it has been seen from beyond another world. That may be the deepest result of all. People often think the point of going outward is to possess new territory, plant flags, claim achievement, prove national or technological superiority. Those motives have indeed shaped parts of space history, and we should be honest about that. But on the level of lasting human consequence, the greatest gift of going outward may be what it gives back to our understanding of home. The far side matters because it makes Earth matter differently. A hidden lunar hemisphere seen again by people reflects humanity back to itself. So what did the Artemis II crew really see? They saw craters, highlands, basins, scars, brightness, shadow, ancient geology, the ferocity of the early solar system written in stone. They saw the side of the moon that never turns toward Earth, the hemisphere hidden by tidal locking, the rougher face of our celestial companion. They saw a world cameras had documented, but human presence had not revisited in more than 50 years. But that is not all they saw. They also saw the distance civilization had once crossed and can cross again. They saw the interruption in history closing. They saw the future becoming slightly less abstract. And what did humanity see through them? It saw that deep space is not sealed off by nostalgia. It saw that the moon can once again be a lived environment for human perception, not just a remote object for robotic study. It saw that a mission need not land to matter profoundly. It saw that witness itself can be historic when it restores a broken line. It saw that the far side, for all its long familiarity and data, still possessed the power to feel newly discovered the instant a living crew looked upon it with their own eyes. There is a temptation to flatten achievements into headlines, to let a sentence consume a miracle. Crew sees far side, mission loops around moon, historic return to lunar vicinity. These are true, but they are too small. What happened here is larger. A human viewpoint absent for over half a century was restored. A hidden landscape re-entered living memory. The ancient relationship between our species and the moon gained a new chapter after a long silence. That is not just news, that is civilizational texture changing. In years to come, this moment may be remembered differently by different people. Engineers may remember the mission as a systems milestone. Scientists may remember the renewed attention to lunar geology and far-side potential. Historians may remember it as the point where deep space human flight truly resumed after the long post-Apollo interval. Children may remember only the image or the phrase that sparked their imagination. Philosophers may talk about perspective, mortality, and the ethics of expansion. All of them will be right, and none will fully contain it. The best human achievements always overflow their categories. If there is one final truth the far side teaches, it is that hidden does not mean unreachable. It means effort has not yet met opportunity. For 54 years, the moon's far side remained out there, turning in silence, reflecting sunlight across craters untouched by human gaze. It did not beckon with sound. It did not complain. It simply waited within the mathematics of orbit and the patience of stone. Then, at last, humans returned to the position from which that hidden world could become immediate again. That is how frontiers often work. They are not conquered by desire alone, but by the long discipline that turns desire into arrival. And now that arrival has happened, the moon is no longer distant in quite the same way. Not because the miles changed, not because the far side became visible from Earth, not because risk disappeared or the future suddenly became guaranteed. It feels closer because living people have been there again. They have seen the hidden hemisphere directly. They have carried that sight back across cislunar space, through atmosphere, into human language. The moon remains a world apart, but it is less lonely in our imagination now, and we are less confined in ours. So remember the real power of this moment. A crew crossed the gulf. A spacecraft passed beyond the familiar face. The hidden hemisphere emerged. The old silence of the far side was broken not by noise, but by witness. Human beings looked upon a world our species had not seen firsthand in 54 years, and in doing so they did not only recover a view, they recovered part of our unfinished future. End.